Syrian Ambassador Bashar Jafari has accused Qatar of presenting the wrong documents as the Arab League report that the Syrian draft is supposed to be based on. Jafari says Qatar is being used as a puppet.
You have to remember that half of Qatar is occupied by the American military bases. So we are talking about a country which is not sovereign fully. We think that Qatar is fulfilling instructions coming from outside.
Jafari added that Arab nations are turning against Qatar as the role the tiny nation played in the Libyan revolution becomes more clear. Libyan leaders accuse Doha of pouring millions into anti-Gaddafi groups and sending weapons in shipments that continued to flow long after Tripoli fell.
Well, welcome everyone and Happy New Year. And it's especially appropriate that I would start this new year with a meeting between myself and Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim, the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar. It's always a great pleasure and an important opportunity for us to get together to discuss the issues that are affecting both of us, and I am delighted that we had this chance to do so. Qatar is and remains a very valuable American partner. As we look back on the year just finished, I'm not sure there was anyone like it. It was an extraordinary time, and during it, our partnership evolved to address new challenges and take advantage of new opportunities, including the unprecedented joint operations with NATO over the skies of Libya. Hear from President Assad in his chillingly cynical speech yesterday was only making excuses, blaming foreign countries, conspiracies so vast that now it includes the Syrian opposition, the international community, all international media outlets, the Arab League itself. And I want to commend the Arab League for showing real leadership. I think that it's clear to both the Prime Minister and myself that the monitoring mission should not continue indefinitely. We cannot permit President Assad and his regime to have impunity. Syrians deserve a peaceful transition. We are looking to work with the Arab League when the current monitoring mission expires on January 19th. And we look again to the Prime Minister for his leadership. So we talked about many things. Those are some of the highlights, but it's again a pleasure to meet with you and to have this chance to exchange views, Prime Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. First of all, Happy New Year to you and to the ladies and gentlemen here. It's my pleasure to be here again. I could not see up till now a successful mission, frankly speaking. I hope it will be successful, but 19th there will be a report, and this report will be very important for us to make the right judgment. We cannot accept to let the situation as it is in Syria and the people killed by their own governments. I think it's the Arab responsibility, but also it's an international responsibility in the end.
Well, some opposition members have said that they reject any idea of talks with President Assad. Why is that?
Because they're under huge pressure from outside powers who want these talks to fail, even before they begin. Most obviously NATO. NATO is determined to bring the Assad regime to its knees as a prelude to invading Iran and also to further marginalizing Russia. You have the Western media, which loves wars. Wars boost ratings, which in turn boosts advertising revenue. And last but by no means least, you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Saudi Arabia is financially and politically backing the civilian opposition, and Qatar has been widely reported to be funding and arming the jihadi rebels who are leading this insurrection. Now, obviously, apart from doing NATO's dirty work, Saudi Arabia and Qatar hate the Syrian regime for a simple reason. It's secular. This is the only secular country that's left in the Middle East now. We've seen the overthrow of secular regimes throughout the region during the past year, and in their place, Islamists who are often very closely aligned with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, if not funded by them, have taken their place. And so this is the Saudi, Qatari, Wahhabi revolution, and its culmination will be the overthrow of the Assad regime, the death of the final secular state in the Arab world, and it's obvious who will take their place, the radical jihadists and their counterparts in the Muslim Brotherhood. Syria is the last bastion of opposition to this bizarre political alliance that's trying to take over the Arab Spring. Between this alliance that is formed by America, Israel and Saudi Arabia. Russia, of course, has its own vested interests, but we can be absolutely sure that this has nothing to do with human rights when it comes to the West's concern, and even more sure when it comes to the concern of Saudi Arabia. This is how preposterous the Western media coverage is of this uprising. Saudi Arabia, of all the countries on earth, complains about human rights abuses on the part of the Assad regime and says it's withdrawing its monitors because it doesn't want to be a false witness to human rights abuses. I mean, Saudi Arabia has a reputation second perhaps only to North Korea in the world for repressing and oppressing and torturing and imprisoning its own people. And so the fact that this can be taken seriously by anyone just shows what level of farce that the coverage in the Western media has fallen to. I mean, foreign intervention, look what's happened in Libya as a result of foreign intervention. You have Islamist militias ruling Tripoli. You have intertribal warfare. You have the imposition of Sharia law. You have desperate economic circumstances in a country that was actually very economically prosperous, and all this in the name of basically an oil grab, of shutting out China from Africa. So Russia, of course, has that experience to draw on, and once bitten, twice shy. They know that if they support a UN resolution that even ostensibly is aimed only at protecting civilians, it will be used by NATO as an excuse to impose a no-fly zone while the Qataris and Saudis fund the jihadis on the ground. And so Russia is essentially crucial in all of this. Russia absolutely must veto any UN resolution that comes at the behest of the NATO allies Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in the near future, because it will just be an excuse for an invasion, and that will lead to a civil war so bloody, so ferocious, so murderous, that it will make what happened in Libya look like a high school prom by comparison.
Right, John R. Bradley, thank you so much for your time. Specialist on Arab countries there and author of the book After the Arab Spring. Thank you for your thoughts and sharing those with us here on RT.
The US, as well as its European and Arab allies, want President Assad gone from power. For its part, Russia says the UN shouldn't be used as a platform for excessive interference in Syrian affairs.
The Security Council cannot prescribe ready recipes for the outcome of domestic political process. It's not in the Charter. We don't want the Security Council to fall into the habit, because once you start, it's difficult to stop. Then you will start telling what king needs to resign and what prime minister needs to step down. This is really not the business of the Security Council.
It's been long the view of the United States that Assad should step aside.
RT's Marina Portnaya there reporting. Well, the West has made a habit of using the UN to legalize its aims of regime change in other countries. Well, this according to peace activist Jacob Hornberger.
That's the whole idea of these resolutions, that they're, no matter how tightly they are constructed, they will always be construed to do whatever the U.S. government and the British government want to do. But one thing's for certain, this is a problem for the Syrian people to resolve, not for the U.S. government, the British government, the United Nations. This is a problem for the Syrian people. So obviously the main thrust of U.S. foreign policy is regime change. We've seen that time and time again. It begins with sanctions, it goes into embargoes, blockades, but ultimately the quest is to remove a recalcitrant dictatorship, install a U.S. regime, even if it happens to be a dictatorship. So this is another classic example of where the U.S. is butting into other people's affairs when it really has no business doing so.
When you talk about certain elements of the opposition approaching the UN for help with this ongoing crisis, you mentioned moments ago that of the further isolation of President Assad. Just who are the groups that are isolating the president? Is it the opposition, the protesters, or is it perhaps the regional powers, the Western powers? Is it perhaps global media networks? Who's to blame for all of this?
No, well, in fact, what I was saying was that it's actually Qatar that is being increasingly, the state of Qatar, that is being increasingly isolated within the Arab League. And I think that President Assad is not being isolated as the West had expected and thought would happen. And the Arab League is divided. I think Syria and Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are increasingly at odds. And I think what we saw with President Assad's speech in a Damascus square, to which tens of thousands came, shows that he has popular support. And that's reflected in polls too. A recent YouGov poll showed a majority of Syrians supporting President Assad. So I don't think he's particularly isolated. But what we see in terms of the Syrian National Council, the exile opposition group, which is really only an umbrella of very diverse groups itself, is in favor of external intervention, but then it was set up for that very purpose by the French and by external bodies. But most of the internal parties, the coordination committees, the internal political groups, are absolutely after what they've seen in Libya, what they saw in Iraq. They have no desire to see external intervention and Syria carried perhaps into sectarian war. So there's a big divide. The opposition is very divided, and it's really only a minority who really believe in external intervention, and of course they're being pushed along and financed from outside.
Well, it's interesting how you say that it's a minority that looks forward to or hopes, that is, for external intervention. It's also, as you mentioned, about comparisons being made between what happened with Libya and Iraq. But the opposition groups are insisting that Assad must go. But do you see a way out of the current crisis without him actually being forced out? Because as you mentioned moments ago, we saw him addressing supporters in the main capital square the other day. It looked like tens of thousands were out there to support him.
But I repeat that I think that you find that the opposition is deeply divided, the Syrian National Council, which was set up to sort of model the Libyan Benghazi Transitional Council, does not reflect opinion inside Syria, and it's very clear. And by that I mean opposition opinion inside Syria, most of whom are not anxious to see Assad go, even though they are very much in favor of reforms and demanding reforms that take place. They fear that external intervention, certainly anything on the Libyan model, would be a disaster internally and would carry the state towards either sectarian or civil war. So within Syria itself, as opposed to the exile groups that are outside it, there's a very strong support both for settling Syrians' problems internally through negotiation and not through external intervention.
The Security Council resolution was vetoed by Russia and China, along with 4 other abstentions. Afterwards, sponsors of the resolution were disappointed and angry.
The United States is outraged that this council has utterly failed to address an urgent moral challenge and a growing threat to regional peace and security.
Russia and Syria both thought the resolution was one-sided and opened the door to even more violence.
We can't agree with its unilateral accusatory bent against Damascus. We believe it unacceptable, the threat of an ultimatum of sanctions against the Syrian authorities.
The level of rhetoric heated up in the council chamber, and when Syria's ambassador blasted U.S. policies and vetoes regarding the Middle East, U.S. Ambassador Susan Rice and her delegation headed out. But before, she took a sharp blast at Russia for its supposed reason for vetoing this resolution.
Let there be no doubt. This is not about military intervention. This is not about Libya. That is a cheap ruse by those who would rather sell arms to the Syrian regime than stand with the Syrian people.
Our vote has nothing to do with that, especially coming from a country which is pumping hundreds of billions dollars of military hardware into the area. This is somewhat amusing.
Human rights groups blasted the double veto, saying it will only lead to more repression of the Syrian people. Russia's ambassador insisted his country is not an advocate for the Assad regime. U.S. Ambassador Rice said it was a sad day for the Syrian people. Richard Roth, CNN, United Nations.